Hey, Tim, I just want to lay out some ground rules for today's lesson in project management.
Let's go ahead and do it. What do you have in mind?
I think we're talking about ground rules today.
Let's
I
do
try
it.
to, I try
Yeah,
to start off with a little merriment, but
let's do it in such a way that we can not just have a good conversation, but have a good way of presenting information that people can take away from here and use on their projects. How's that?
that's actually that's kind of what we try to do every week. But let's really think about it that way. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, let's do that. And again, what we're thinking of is how can we actually start off a group on the right foot in such a way that they can actually contribute to the success. Um, it's funny because we don't think about this. We think about groups just naturally doing this stuff. But when you get to have a large group, like 75 or 50 team members, not only does it have to be formal, it's something you have to constantly be doing. Yeah.
I sense an experiential story coming from your background.
Most of my experience is through mistakes and failures. So
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
um, it's funny that my supervisor, my first supervisor in a transportation company, always started off on that foot. He always said, "Okay, guys, let's have some agreement on how we're going to work together." And even if it was just five of us getting together, he said, "Guys, let's make this reasonable and common sense. We don't need to have something truly formal, but we got to have some rules on what we're going to share, when we're going to share it, and how we can treat each other as we're going through." Now, I took this as a call to action like it was law. And it was funny because a lot of my early projects, people would not listen to me and they wouldn't take me seriously. And so when I said this, they'd roll their eyes and they'd be frustrated. Um, and I didn't take it to heart. It wasn't them that they were rolling. It was the fact that you know, here was this young kid telling people in their then 30s and 40s, trying to do what to do. And so it wasn't until I got comfortable with my role and the authority that project management lent me that I gave myself permission to actually be a little authoritative in this. Yeah, it was funny that this was one of the very first areas where I learned how to manage the situation, not just allow the situation to go in its direction.
and what's interesting from my experience also is that in my when I was younger in my career, a lot of the projects we did were smaller, and therefore it could be handled by by pulling from different aspects of our company, of our workforce, who are generating project revenues. And so it was easy because from a company perspective, it made sense. We had ground rules. But where it really got interesting, and I'm glad you brought this up, where it really got interesting was as our projects got larger and larger and larger, and suddenly our teams became perhaps 30% company people, 70% subcontracting staff. Ground rules became even more important to be able to formalize those so that people would all be working from the same page. So yeah, I can see what
Right.
you're talking about. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and again, they're not something new and not something invented. Norms, norms, normal behavior that are expected, ground rules, fundamental rules that we all agree to adhere by. And it's funny that, we don't think about this, but just by agreeing and committing to them, we're actually agreeing and committing to number one, the validity of the work. This work is pretty serious, so we better work together. Number two, committing to the group. We have a group and we have a set of rules that say if we don't do this, the work doesn't get done. So it it's really comforting to a lot of people to actually say, okay, we're doing this on the right foot. We're actually getting things in place so we don't have to think about them again.
Well, and as you're talking, it just reminded me years ago. You probably remember this. It was when Electronic Data Services had a commercial during the football game during the Super Bowl. They had all these cowboys and horses chasing cats. And I think they called it herding cats. And without ground rules, that's what it feels like. It's that the people are all over the place doing their own thing. And how can you function as a team to deliver a project that your client is expecting from you?
Right, right. So let's set aside the whole concept of learning as we went in the early part of our careers about what works and what doesn't. How do you set ground rules, and how do you establish the rules that people are going to work by? What's a good method for you?
Well, for me, and I think I've admitted this in public in past podcasts, is the best way that I know of is the team charter. Now, what I've admitted in public is I've never actually developed a team charter, but at least not a formal one. And I should be very clear about not a formal team charter. My fault. It should have been done. But what I've often done, and I'd like to hear your side of this as well, is when we begin to form the team, is to bring everyone into a room and spend a few hours just kind of going over, this is what's going to be expected of us. This is a tough client or this is an easy client. You just go through all of the variations. And yes, you verbalize it, and probably 10 minutes after you leave the room, people forget. But as time goes on, you remind people of what you had talked about, and those ground rules begin to kind of become part of your foundational aspect of your team. But Tim, I will admit, the team charter is probably the best way, and I've never done it.
Yeah, it's a formal document. Um, in my consulting career, what we agreed as project managers was to actually have a project overview slide set, basically a PowerPoint that said, here's the kickoff, welcome to the kickoff. Here's the team. Here are the key stakeholders, high key stakeholders. Here's how we're going to work together. And what I found out later on were some of the silliest things that you can talk about, were some of the best things. Make it a humanistic environment. Number one, not only team members, but people who are going to be critical for the project also understood that things are going to be on a regular basis. Things are going to be, not quote unquote by the book, but you're going to have some type of discipline. And number three, if you're doing this in the kickoff, we can expect to be relatively comfortable throughout the rest of the project. For example, um, we're flying to a part in Illinois that many of you have been to and many have not. Here's some restaurants. Here's the hotel. Here's the concierge service. Here is a group of people that are really helpful. And by the way, you're not going to get a cab after 11 p.m. All of a sudden, if we can actually put those type of things that may or may not be what we consider good in a team charter, it sets that expectation of here's how we're going to treat each other, not just in words, but in deeds.
Yeah, now I will say, you reminded me, yes, every single project I have ever been on, we have had a project kickoff meeting. Both internal and then also with our client staff
Yeah.
or our stakeholders. And so that's also helped to set some ground rules. I remember I was working on a fairly large project with a Midwestern government organization. And I ended up having a team. I was advising the government, and they selected a system integrator to come in and work. And so I spent the first probably couple, 2-3 weeks of my time with the client staff that had been brought in from their field locations to work on a project. People who didn't know how to work on projects. All they knew was field work. A computer to them was the old green screen. So putting together a brand new system from scratch was totally foreign to these people that were assigned to me as their advisor. And I spent probably 2 to 3 weeks working with them in terms of how it is that they will be um, asked, or with the kinds of things that they will be asked to do by the system integrator, and how to deal with those, how to deal with system integrator staff that are very, very bright, very, very quick. Not that our staff wasn't. Our staff was just as bright and quick. It's just that they weren't steeped in anything that was IT related. So we spent a lot of time establishing those ground rules in terms of how to behave with working and dealing with the system integrator. And that helped a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Boy, the comfort level and the confidence that you can provide with
Yeah.
any, pre pre-captured information. That's brilliant. It really is. Um, that leads me to a really interesting question. So you're saying these things, and I haven't thought about them. What are the things that you do that you think aren't necessarily normally thought of in a team charter, but have been handy for you? I know you and I have talked about some, but what do you like to have that you think is unique?
Well, certainly from what I just described, that would, had we had a formal team charter on the client side, which typically is not done, we would have included some of those things in terms of how to deal with system integration. More importantly, how to deal with an unfamiliar concept to you. But I think overall, working with project staff, working with my own team, let's say I am on the IT side, much like what you had talked about. I know in one project, we had built an entire SharePoint site with all of the ground rules and all of the nice information, like you were saying. So, ground rules such as if you take a flight to the project site, these are the airlines you use, and this is the limit of the dollar amount, that sort of thing. No first class tickets. No, just those sorts of things that people don't necessarily think of. Because I've been on projects where you get some young systems analysts that think, wow, we've made the big leagues. I'm working for one of these big projects. I'm going to fly first class wherever I go. It just doesn't work. So, yeah, just to be able to think through almost like an FAQ of how to behave and what the norms are in the project.
Yes, yes, yes. And as you were talking, I was thinking, boy, some of the things that I've really my project have benefited was when I stirred up um, everything I could understand about that company. Not just the fact that it's in this industry and sector and these are the
Yeah.
key players, but it's the actual culture. For instance, one of my clients at 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon would put a bong, you know, bong on the intercoms in every building across the planet. And it was like everybody stood up and stretched. A few people got coffee, and some people went in the corner, even did like 3 or 4 minutes of formal exercise together. And we were thinking, first time I went to them, I was going, is this company crazy? No, they just had a very formal approach to, Pomodoro, to, creating an opportunity to step away from the work, clear their heads before they have that next stretch of work, and having people actually exposed to that. Another one that I worked well with was I was doing a data center inventory project, and I was actually a program manager for a lot of the data center assessment work. And we were doing it in the energy sector, fuel and oil primarily. And every site you had to actually sign in and spend 10 or 15 minutes before you've ever been on site before to go through a little tape, get your OSHA compliance signed off and make sure everything was fine. And it was like, wow, that's weird the first time I did it. Turning that around and putting that in the team charter for the rest of the projects was like, oh boy, it made us look professional, but it made us feel professional.
Well, it's almost like a checklist, right? I mean, at this project site, here are the parking places that you are assigned. Do not park outside of those parking places. If you and just silly things. Now, some of the things that I really work on my team with, especially in that introductory session that we get together, was some thou shalt nots. Thou shalt
Mhm.
not ever come to a meeting unprepared.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to waste any time in a meeting. Yeah, we'll have some niceties up front, but once we're in there, it's all business, and we're not rehashing things. We're prepared. Another one is thou shalt not share anything outside of the project unless it goes through your project management or unless it goes through your executive. And it gets to the point where I've been on projects where even social media, I would communicate with my LinkedIn people, that kind of thing. But never once on my LinkedIn would you ever see the project I was working on or have people outside of my LinkedIn group know what it was that I was doing because the client didn't want that. So those are kind of ground rules that have to be established just even in order to protect your project and your company from any kind of liability.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, certainly. We're almost getting outside of this cultural mores and norms into these political and legal and policy wide things. And again, that's great for a kickoff, but to have it as part of the team charter, it's again, it it's not like trying to minimize the amount of decisions a team can make. It actually creates a framework where people in their minds feel safe and comfortable to be within.
Yeah. How about things, Tim, like how it is that we make decisions or resolve conflicts? Would you put something like that in a team charter formally?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. One the the way I would talk about a team charter over a cup of coffee would be, you know, what are the things we need to discuss in order to make sure that this team works well together? And communication is there. Anything about a relationship is there. Anything about, keeping the work moving forward is there. So communication,
Hmm.
handling debates, we're not going to argue, we're going to debate. And things that are more ethical instead of legal and moral. Um, it's like, how are we going to treat each other with respect? How are we going to make a decision, based on the merit of the decision, not by our opinions? And shaping it in that manner actually allows people to say, oh, this is this type of a team where we look at the best idea, not the loudest player.
Well, it also just to let people know that it's okay to disagree. In fact, we welcome disagreement because quite often in trying to defend a different position, and I come around to your way of thinking, I realize that there are more than one ways to skin the cat. And that your idea, even though I disagree with it, actually in this situation may result in something that's even better. And so I think in that disagreement, one of the things you talked about, don't argue, let's debate. Even in that debate, we are attacking the idea, not the person.
Right, right. And this is where we can actually use our project management knowledge. What's the difference between agreement and consensus?
Mm,
One
yeah.
of the corporations I worked for in the late '90s, early 2000s said the day one when you're employed, we're not going to say that your opinion is bad. We're going to capture all opinions, but we're going to have a formal way to address this. It's called disagree and commit. And you had to go through 2 hours of training and role play of, here's how I disagree. I retain my self respect and my dignity. I go on record by having a different opinion, but I also commit to the support and the direction that the group itself has decided. And yeah, that's a brilliant move on behalf of a team to make sure that you capture potential innovations, yet you don't slow the work.
Well, and you're going to laugh at this, but one of the things that I learned early on in my career was in team interaction, we always watched our butts. And
Uh-huh.
what I mean by that is if someone said yes, but we'd say, no, no, rephrase it as yes, and. And it's amazing how just that little switch in wording caused a switch in thinking. And right away, you were in a situation where you weren't fighting the other idea. You were giving it a chance, but you were also putting your own spin on what you thought might improve the situation. So,
It's really funny because that change in semantics takes the discussion from across a table to on the same side of the table. And we think it's inconsequential, but boy, it does change the behavior and attitude and mindset.
well, I was watching I watch the Animal Planet every once in a while. And I was watching these mountain goats, these two male mountain goats fighting for territory. And they did the head butt. And
Mhm.
that was painful just to watch. But when you saw the flock of sheep or goats afterwards walking together side by side, that's more like the picture of the yes and. It's far less painful and it looks very much more cooperative,
Well, yeah, there's more progress.
right? Right.
Now here's a question for you, what my students often ask. Do you ever get in the middle of a project and the team charter needs to change?
Oh, all the time. I don't know that I've ever had a project where I didn't have to change, unless it was a very small, short duration. But no, circumstances change. In fact, even sometimes if a project is more of a phased implementation or something, the different phases have different rules, different ground rules, different objectives. So you could end up with a situation where they truly do change. And most often, it's the result of a required course correction.
Yeah. Yeah, I like what you brought up. There are two situations where I was thinking of, and you brought them both up. Number one, there's a course correction. We're thinking COVID, or in the United States, 9/11,
Yeah.
when there was a huge lockdown. All of a sudden, guys, we got to think of a different way to work. But then, just the nature of the work can shape it. Like you said, we're entering a phase of the work where it's a lot of individual contribution and there's a lot of analysis. So we're going to have to watch each other's backs and make sure communication doesn't drop, or we're coming up to the wrap up. So let's go ahead and make sure and add a couple extra meetings so that we continue this and people just don't drop off the project.
I was in a situation once where our major stakeholder was changed. And we went from a very affable, collaborative, stern, but collaborative stakeholder to one who was absolutely dictatorial. And, we had some ground rules in terms of working with the original stakeholder that worked very well for us. But when this austere dictatorial person came on board, we literally had a meeting of our project leadership, and looked at how it is that we were going to still make progress on the project, complete it on time and on schedule while satisfying the demands of this new person. And yeah, those ground rules absolutely changed because the person themselves changed that we were beholden to.
Yeah, in a consulting environment, you're bound by contract law and by the terms of the contract. And, there a lot of the flexibility of the environment within which you're working has to be adhered to, just the contract itself.
And this is where I find, Tim, where I find the project managers who are worth their weight in gold are the most effective when the ground rules change, especially if it's because of a force that you aren't expecting. And if you have a project manager who can see the big picture, but think at the detail level, who is prepared to take a risk in terms of how we should shift suddenly, and then also be able to grasp the context quickly so that the decisions that are made based on an observable fact as opposed to just some opinion or just let's try this. If you get a project manager who is that kind of flexibility and agility, you'll end up with far better course corrections and a far better way of developing those new ground rules in which the entire team can work.
That's where I found integration as a very unique skill, as well as one of the most interesting skills for me, because that's where, we're looking at the individual details, the risk and the scope and the schedule and the resources, stakeholders, communication, and so forth. But you're pulling them together at a high level. And you're right. The balance between, zooming out to the big picture versus working at the intricate details takes knowledge and experience that you can't really just pick up by reading a book once.
Right.
And you're going to make a few mistakes, and it's best if you observe other project managers who've done this for a decade or two.
Yeah. And that's why, and I tell you, I'm in a situation right now where um, it's a fantastic project I'm on, but I am learning. I'm even at as accomplished as I am in my career, I'm learning. And the way I learn is I keep my mouth shut and both ears open because I'm observing, I'm watching, I'm seeing. And then when I'm asked for my contribution, I'm ready to give it because I'm aware of the big picture, but I can also hone in on the details that are required. So yeah, we never stop learning. And this whole idea of ground rules is a major requirement of any project manager who's worth his weight in any kind of salt or gold or whatever you want to put it.
So that leads us into a really interesting spot. As a project manager, we have to maintain discipline. And so, how do you actually look and behave when people step outside of the team charter? When do you think it's important to, start enforcing? And um, when do you actually say, okay, this is where we can't have this? What are the measuring sticks you use for those two different responses to deviating from team charter?
Man, all I can say from a consultant's point of view, and that's all I've ever been as a consultant, is it depends. I mean, if that's the standard consulting answer, right? It depends. I mean, I've been in situations where, for example, I have a recalcitrant team member, but somehow they got put into a very key discipline on the project. So now I'm faced with how do I handle this person who has a negative attitude and is causing ripples through the whole project versus replacing him or her with someone who now has a 3 or 4 month learning curve. So you're always balancing something. And so typically I start with the individual who has the problem or who has the problem for me. He may not have a problem or she may not have a problem in her mind, but it is a problem for me in the project. And so I typically start with identifying the cause. What caused this person to be recalcitrant, to have such a negative attitude, to create these ripples on the project? And so I'll stop there and see if you have anything to add. But that's my first thing is I would try to identify the cause in the bad behavior.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. What you just said. What you just said. Behavior. People are not wrong or right. People are human beings. It's the behavior that I'm interested in as a project manager. I'm only going to see these people for the length of the project. So what I want to say is, look, I don't want to change you. This behavior is getting in the way. And all of a sudden, just like you said, between the buts and the ands,
Mhm.
all of a sudden I'm not face to face with a personal conflict with the person. I can actually sit side by side with them and talk about the behavior that's getting in the way, not the
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
That does that goes a long way. The
It
sec
does. Go
the
ahead.
second thing, and then I'll get your opinion on this. The second thing is an incredibly proactive attitude. Number 1, being curious about people. Number 2, having a well thought out and a well-maintained relationship with that team member's organizational manager, their functional manager, and if I am on the ball, can solve almost any problem. The functional managers have the history with this person, and that I want to get access to because I don't want to have a challenge. I want to have something that I can straighten out quickly.
No, that's exactly right. And I, by the way, I'm used to that coming from prior to my own consulting career, prior to my going out on my own as a consultant when I was part of a large corporation. I worked in a matrix management situation, which is kind of what you just described. And I at one point reported to 6 different managers. Now, people look at that and say, "Well, that's crazy." Well, it is and it isn't because we had a very well honed ability to deal with the matrix, and so exactly what you're talking about in that matrix situation, I could go to either their line manager or we also had managers who were career managers, kind of our mentors. So I could go to different people to try to find out what's going on here. What happened here? Why is this person being this way? And how can I help this person? So
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, even in a client vendor situation, we can do this because when I walk onto a client site, they assign people. And so I often talk to a client and say, I've worked with these people who are deep analysts before and they're individual contributors. Would you mind if I find certain behaviors getting in the way of the work that I pick your brain and I work with you? I don't want to pull people off projects or anything. I want to create a really good relationship here these next 9 months and see what they think about that. And they actually at that point, number 1, are respectful of the fact that I'm thinking ahead. And number 2, often say, I'm not going to have time for this, but there's this guy over here that's a really good friend of theirs. And they work a lot together. And you can bounce ideas off that guy.
Yeah. The other thing that I've done that I found works well is to say, well, obviously we always sit down with the person. You can't just summarily dismiss someone or transfer them into another part of the organization. So you want to give the person a chance. You want to get down to, as I mentioned, identify the cause. But secondly, I also, as I sit down with the person and we talk this through, I also make the person aware of how his behavior or her behavior is affecting the rest of the project and what other people are observing and how it is actually causing detrimental effects on the project's progress. And sometimes what I've found is that once you go into that kind of detail, people go and they look at you and they say, I didn't realize that. I don't understand. Yeah, I will change. I will definitely make sure that my behavior no longer affects the project that way. So sometimes it's just a matter of making them aware that their behavior is causing issues.
Yeah. Number 1, you're allowing them to save face and that, they're maintaining their self-respect. And so they're not going to lock down on you. And number 2, you're giving them an opportunity to grow, which is again, they may not appreciate it now, but in the months and years to come, they're going to remember this. And I've had people come back to me and say, thanks for that input. I really don't like that, you did it. But, that changed the way I looked at this work, and it really did improve my opportunities.
Yeah, I also had when I was working for a major corporation, actually a couple of corporations. One of the privileges that I consider this a privilege, one of the privileges that I had was to be able to sit down at the beginning of every project and also at the beginning of every year in which I was being reviewed. Right, you're reviewed kind of at the project basis and on your annual submission of how you did that year. But we would set our objectives up front. And in doing so, they were written, they were documented, they were in our desk drawer. So then if I ended up with a behavioral issue, which is what we're talking about right now, I could pull those objectives out and say, okay, this is what we discussed at the beginning of the project. Let's see how we're meeting them. I know it's not time for your semi-annual or your annual review, but I'm observing some things. Let's look at those observations in terms of your project objectives and see how we're meeting those. Suddenly that becomes an eye opener for this person who realizes that maybe their next promotion or next raise is on the line as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The acknowledgement from them that number one, you have a deep relationship with their management chain. And number two, you have a very good understanding of connecting how their contributions meet the objectives. And all of a sudden they say, oh, here's the data. But,
Yeah.
it works to the benefit too.
Mhm.
When people are receiving that from you, both from a negative standpoint and a positive standpoint, number one, they have an opportunity to grow. Number two, they have an opportunity to use what you're giving them to actually validate that they need a promotion. And it works in the favor of both. It's developing those professional relationships, that actually look at recognition, at treating people like unique individuals.
Well, and the other thing that just occurred to me, this has happened to me probably more than once in my career, is in that identifying the cause and then discussing the objectives and how we're going to move forward on my career. Is in that discussion, we find out that we've just tried to put a round peg in a square hole or a square peg in a round hole, and realizing that we as an organization have not done any good service to this person. And this person's what we consider bad behavior is because they didn't know how to vocalize that they were in the wrong position and didn't like what they were doing. But could they do that over there where they would excel? And so sometimes we as an organization also have to look at the responsibility of how it is that we're working with our people and what it is that we have them doing.
And this gets into, when is it time to replace a team member? And this is one of the big conversations that students really want to talk about. And you've said it quite well. Um, Oftentimes, it's a coin flip. You know, Number one, did we do our diligence versus did somebody give us somebody inadvertently? And I like to start off thinking maybe it was me that was in the wrong, that didn't do enough analysis, because I can correct that quickly. If it's my mistake, yay, I can fix
Yeah,
that in a second, right? And that's the beautiful thing. I don't mind being wrong. I don't mind making mistakes because I have immediate control over fixing those.
exactly. I remember being in a position where it was my database architect, and I observed, and not you just you kind of notice patterns, and I noticed a pattern in her behavior that was starting to kind of concern me a little bit, just a little bit here, a little bit there, and so immediately I thought this could end up in a bad place. And so I called my management and explained the situation, and we immediately identified someone who could back this person up, and we brought that person on as a understudy. And would you believe it or not, this uh, database architect that I was talking about ended up having a unfortunate, it was, well, we call it a nervous breakdown. That's our kind of parlance, but it was a situation that we had to help her out with the medical need Fortunately, because of that observation, this young person that I had brought in as the understudy was able to immediately pick up and take over. So from a project perspective, yes, it did cost me two people in one position, basically. But overall, over the length of the project, it ended up probably working itself out as a net to the project because we never lost a single minute of having to retrain someone once the database architect left the project.
So we're talking about being proactive. We're talking about having very active risk management, and we're talking about, you know, assessing and managing issues such as single points of contact, of single points of failure.
Yes.
It seems that, a lot of this is common sense, and it all focused back on the success of the project.
It is common sense, but I can tell you this, that when all of that went down, this example, all of my team leads came to me and said, "How did you see? We never saw that. We never." It's because they weren't observing. They were heads down, arts and charts, task, 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 and they weren't observing. You have to, I think, as a project manager, you have to work in that relationship strata so that you can truly work with your team both at a task level and at the relationship level as well. So to me, it was a miss on their part because they weren't paying attention.
So this is what I discovered, and I learned this early. I learned it working with people in the office first. Um, Scheduling 15 minutes, about 15 minutes a week, right?
Yeah.
And touching base with people, not on a, are you getting your work done, but just checking in on you, seeing, do you need anything? Is there anything coming up, outside of work? What's driving you? And it's coming from a place of curiosity, not from a place of I have to update my dashboard.
Yeah.
And then actually using that and assessing that data to say, do we need some training here? Do we need some monitoring? Do we need some mentoring? Do we need to grow the team? This individual, 15 minutes a week for the people I'm touching the most on my project is some of the most critical time that I can spend um, for the project's success.
You just reminded me of something. I tried to give you two quick examples. On one of my projects, I had a young woman who was on our acceptance test team who would see me come into the office perhaps a little early, and she would come in excited. She would literally lean back in her chair, put her feet up on my desk. She was that comfortable with our conversation before work. And she would tell me about this book she was planning to write. What does that have to do with the project? Absolutely nothing, except that it created a relationship between her and I. We would talk about book writing and that sort of thing. And as a result of that, because of the relationship, whenever we got into a difficult situation, we could rely on the fact that we were friends, even though there had to be some sort of different kind of interaction that happened at that point. And here it is years later, she's written that book.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It's funny. One of my most treasured feedbacks on a performance review was like about what 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And the guy said, I don't see Tim doing a lot of work, but I know when Tim's around, everything seems to just work well and we don't have to worry about things. And I think to myself, that's a project manager who's getting their
Yeah.
work done.
The second example I was going to give you was similar. Was another woman on the project would come in and she would be excitedly talking about her three sons who were playing baseball. And from that conversation, I got to know a little bit about her and her family. But more importantly, there were nights that I had to make sure she got out of the office because she had a baseball game. And because I was observant and kind of paying attention to her needs to get home to that baseball game, and she became one of my best workers. She would do anything because I had shown her loyalty.
Thank you, Maslow.
Yes.
Understanding the fulfillment of personal needs
Yeah,
as as a motivational component. People, if you actually position the work in such a way that it fulfills their position, their personal needs, they'll do the work better than you could ever ask them.
absolutely. But there is one other part about this, and it is those situations. We're still on the topic of what happens when you have to release a team member, particularly for behavior that is not in keeping with the pact that we made up front. The part that project managers hate to do, even though IT projects are all about documentation, when it comes to personnel issues, project managers hate to document, but you do. You do need to document because at some point, if it goes to HR, if it goes to another, and just to be fair to the person you're working with, you need to show them what it is that you're looking at in terms of their observable um, behavior that may be that may be causing problems on the project. Just to be fair to them and to you and to your project team, you have to have it documented so that if there needs to be a move, it is well understood why.
Yeah, and again, it's it it's just like talking to a person. Talking to your project journal here is just like talking to a person. Observed this behavior. This behavior got in the way of us hitting this milestone or push the milestone out 5 days. And having that documented, not the person, but the behavior actually allows you to have action steps that don't attack people. And
Yeah.
people cannot actually, perceive it as attacking them. Yet they see there is a gap, and giving people an out. Always be forward thinking and thinking, if this person is not up to task of this work, do I need to have some options in place where they can scoot out of the project and somebody can quickly come in without disrupting the project?
Yeah. One time, one time I went against HR. HR required us in the company I worked for. They required us to formalize this with a memo to the file, signatures, all this kind of stuff. Well, that immediately puts everyone on the defensive because suddenly it's come to the eyes of HR, right? But one of the things that I did going against HR without HR knowing was I would handwrite something and saying, okay, Brian, this is what I noticed. This is how this is the issue it caused. Let's look at doing these four things, showing it to Brian in my handwriting. Does that make sense to you, Brian? Yeah, it does. Can you just initial right here so that you and I have this agreement between just you and I to make sure that this works? Well, it's amazing how the fact that it wasn't formalized, it didn't look like a huge penalty situation, but it was documented, even if it was in handwriting, but it just seemed to go much further towards having that person change their behavior.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's respectful, it's protecting the person's dignity, and also it's establishing the discipline that we can actually work towards. And we can use this not as a heavy hammer, but as a guideline as we move forward. And if that behavior is not changing, with that in place, we can say we're at risk here. What do you suggest? What are the options you see? And we can actually brainstorm with those people that we have an ongoing relationship with now, instead of confronting the worker who's bad.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So having gone through, and we probably spent the majority of our podcast on this issue, but it really is ground rules, behavior, etc. But what happens if you have that person that just can't change or won't change? How is it that you then go about deciding that they need to be replaced, and how is it that you go about replacing?
Well, again, I think we've talked around this, and all we have to do is some data collection. Number one, if you're working with the professional environment on a regular basis, if you're proactive and you have a relationship with their management chain as well as the formal organizational processes that you have to follow, It's it's a decision of consensus. And if you have the team member as part of that ongoing discussion, the consensus includes a team member. So all of a sudden, you have a larger group to pull on to successfully move that person out into a more successful position and move somebody in to maintain the progress and the success of the work.
What I'd be interested too, and I'm guessing from my experience, probably about half the time, the person that we're dealing with self-selects and say, I'd rather go somewhere else. I don't think I can make it here or for whatever reason, right? Um, but there are times when just working with that person, you can at least leave the relationship intact, even though they self-select and say, I want to move on. I want to go somewhere else. So sometimes it just works out for the better, even that way. But at least the animosity is not there. The conflict is managed, and we try to protect both the dignity and the career progress of the person, even if it's not on this project at this time.
Exactly, exactly. It's again, it's an ethical way to manage these situations. It's not just by the book. It's not only fulfilling the needs of all these organizations that are in place to protect the work, but it also is, it maintains dignity and respect. And we all need that. And if we don't give that out, how can we expect the work environment to give it to us?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So do the ground rules apply also to your client or your major stakeholders?
Ooh, I like to. I like to. I when the project is truly unique, I like to build consensus. For instance, when I have a client that's in another country and they've never worked on an international project before, it's not formal, like saying, here's the team charter and here's the ground rules, but it's informally establishing this as a culture, that we're going to have for this project in order for the project to be successful. So yeah, informal or formal, I like to have that established.
What's interesting for me is the way I've been consulting the last several years, it's actually written into my contract in terms of, my responsibilities, the client's responsibilities, our roles, how we interact and that sort of thing. Yeah, there are other things that we work through once the contract is established, but a lot of that becomes contractual behavior. If you can legislate behavior, those contracts are pretty good at it.
Well, it's not legislation. It actually, and that's what a contract is. If you look at contracts themselves, it has to do with an exchange and a relationship that falls within contract law. And so it makes sense that these are the expectations that we're going to have in place for this to happen. You're spot on with that comment.
Well, and I have a lot of my contracts with deal with things like my work product. If the client deems that my work product is not sufficient in their eyes, they respond with comments. And I have X number of days to respond with a cleaned up version. And if that doesn't work, then we go into a corrective action process. So if my client and it can put those things in place for me, and then if I can rely on what they're also required to do as part of their aspect of that work product, um, if all of that works in that relationship, why can't I deal with my own team members with as much dignity and give them as much time to give corrective action or whatever? So it all comes down to, again, I think just relationship, strengthening that relationship and keeping it strong.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So the final question we have is, again, if I was to actually go into my very first kickoff as project manager and I wanted to set ground rules, basically create norms and ground rules for how we're going to work on the project, what are a simple five or less topics that you'd advise them to touch on?
Right. I think we talked about it earlier, right? And that you brought it up very succinctly. I think communication is number one.
Mhm.
Handling of conflict is probably another one that I would deal with. A third one, it would be perhaps even just something in terms of even the work environment, the core hours, that, some of the logistics. That's three that I can think of off the top of my head. There's probably several others.
Yeah, how about morals? How about behavior?
Behavior,
Uh,
yeah.
how are we going to treat physical resources and knowledge, and how are we going to treat our relationship with each other on the team?
Yeah.
Again, you mentioned specific. How are we going to debate and argue conflict?
Yeah.
How are we going to share information? But all of these things point to a more general. How do we keep this group cohesive? Because in the end, it's the group that gets the work done. It's not the individuals.
But let me back up. Your question was, how would a new project manager on their their kick up, how would they instill this? Let me offer this to those who are not yet project managers who are listening to us today. Start right now and observe. Watch what your project manager does. Write it down in your journal. And then when it's your turn, do likewise, especially if it's effective.
Yeah, yeah. That again, duplicating success. It's not copying other people. It's working smart. It's capturing those organizational process assets and lessons learned. Very good.
And the other thing, and I'll do this real quick. I know we're going to sign off here shortly, but the other thing I've done when I've been in situations like this and kind of like just at my wit's end is I've gone to publications such as the Harvard Business Review or um, sometimes Computer World. There's just some publications where you do a Google search and say, here's my problem. Are there any articles of wisdom out there that can help me with my problem? You'd be amazed at what a simple Google search will bring up that you could wade through and say, aha, here's the wisdom I need to apply.
It's all out there. It just
Oh,
needs a little organization and sorting.
go ahead.
So thanks again. I appreciate this. This has been really, really beneficial for me.
Yeah, me too.
So,
Absolutely.
so where can we find you next week if we have questions or want to reach out?
Yeah, that fount of wisdom where I also go called LinkedIn. It's amazing how much wisdom. There's a lot of theory out there, but my goodness, there's some people that you can learn to follow. They are so wise. And so LinkedIn is a place that I like to kind of prowl around a little bit, offer some comments and just see if I can take some of someone else's experience and apply it to my own situation.
And myself as well. I'm starting to reach out. Some of you may have seen me reaching out to say hi or ask questions of you. I'm actually really excited working with those of you who have connected with me over the last years.
And what I just talked about too, I don't know why I hadn't brought this up before, but if I was an up and coming project manager today, I would absolutely go into LinkedIn and attach myself to several gurus in the industry and just kind of follow what they're saying and just kind of make mental notes or physical notes just to say, this, I need to use this on my next project. It works.
Very good. Well, thanks again, Merv. I can't wait to find out what we're talking about next week, and looking forward to our ongoing conversation.
I was surprised today even by some of our conversation because you never know which way these podcasts will go, but it was a great discussion today. So thanks. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks again.